really shake us to the core and to change our whole trajectory of the way that we operate. And when we go about them consciously and really pay attention, we find ourselves in one hell of a classroom that's going to teach us a great deal about becoming our most authentic self, as well as, I believe, an opportunity for us to be closer in what I say, union, reunion, and communion with the divine. So, life waits. It's really, I think, where it's at.
Okay. Now, you said that everybody experiences life shocks. Someone probably has some this morning, I would guess, depending on how their morning went. What's the most important thing that you've learned that you find helpful for somebody who encounters one of these?
Okay. Life quakes. I get confused, but with life quakes that shake us to the core, there's so many things I learned. When we get to it, we kind of get to a decision tree, if you will. And I can remember when I divorced and came out, that was a huge thing in my 40s. That was a huge life quake. And that I chose to try to wallpaper the pain. It wasn't very successful. But when we get to that, we can wallpaper over the pain. Or we can do our best to try to make things back to the way they were, which I tried as well. And none of those really work. They'll resolve back. Or we can choose to really face them. And when we really face them, that's the lessons that we'll learn. What I learned was that when we really pay attention, that's the opportunity that we really have to grow and the opportunity that we really have to evolve. And it's unfortunate, but a lot of times we have to be brought to our knees to do that.
So, do you think struggles like this are the only way to grow? Are they essential to growth? Or is there another way we can learn in resolve this?
I think we're just stuck. And I use the example of the universal UPS truck. The universal UPS truck comes up to our door, right? And he knocks on the door, and we are too busy to answer the door. So we just ignore it. And the next day, he shows up, and he bangs a little louder, and we're still busy, so we ignore it. So the next day he comes, and he really pounds on the door, ringing the doorbell, and we still ignore it. So the next day, what does he do? He drives the truck through our living room. Then we pay attention. And unfortunately, that's what it takes sometimes for somebody or something or some circumstance to drive a truck through our living room to capture our attention. There's a beautiful quote by Viktor Frankl. All may remember that Viktor Frankl was in a concentration camp while his wife was just literally in an awful situation, but still found purpose in it. And he wrote in his wonderful book, Man's Search for Meaning, he says, "You do not have to suffer to learn. But if you don't learn from suffering, then your life becomes truly meaningless." I love that.
And what do you, this is not one that we sort of talked about beforehand, but I want to do a little tangent to that. What do you see that helps people pay attention when the knock comes sooner than the drive through? Are there ways that people can be more attentive to those before they get to the truck coming to the living room?
Absolutely. I believe that if we pay, for instance, the little life, as opposed to the life quakes, the little life shocks that show up, often have smaller lessons to teach us. And when we pay attention to that, then I think it makes a difference. What I found and what I believe is that life is here to teach us how to evolve, how to be closer, how to be more in union and communion with the divine. And so it is designed to where everything in life provides a lesson when we pay attention. And everything from our dreams, a lot of times bring messages, to every situation, to even things as little when I meet somebody and they just work my last nerve. And I'm smart enough to realize there's something about me that's being reflected back in that I need to pay attention. So I think that when we pay attention to the lessons that life is continuing to teach us, perhaps the universal UPS truck doesn't have to drive that truck right through our living room. Perhaps,
yeah. So talking about being present with quakes, and shocks in learning lessons. Can you share some of the things that you've learned from this process that triggered this with Don's accident and the life that has led you into?
Absolutely. I'll give you a very simple one. Was receiving. I was much better about giving than receiving. To receive is really tough. And to be and to call the church, and to ask to be on the meal wagon, and to have these wonderful meals being delivered to the house, what a godsend. But gosh, how difficult to do. And I remember a friend of mine, Ann, lost her husband about 6 years ago, and we were having coffee shortly after that, and she was just wailing, and she said, how people have been so kind, how on earth am I going to pay them back? And I said to her, you know, Ann, the thing you have to remember is by allowing them to give to you, they are receiving. They feel good about it. And I had to take my own advice. And the more I sat with it, the more I realized that giving and receiving is like this affinity loop. And when we give, we receive, and when we receive, we give. And when we keep doing this more and more often, the two become one. And so one of the major lessons for me has been, it's still a long way to go, but learning how to be a better receiver, if you will. The other lesson that's been a huge one is, and especially in the day and the times that we live in now, I am learning, I have a long way to go, but I am learning that despite of the circumstances that life may bring to us, that when I go inside, when I spend inside, there's a calm, abiding place that's within. And when I can access it, which isn't all the time, but when I can, that regardless of the circumstances, that regardless of how bad things are in the external world, there's a peace within that I can go and sit and be in silence. And that's why I love the opportunity to walk the ladder, the opportunity to be quiet and simmering prayer. And as a result, I've now created a spiritual discipline where almost every morning I spend a little bit of time in silence to again find that place and to begin my day from a centered place. Still have a long way to go, but that's very important. So two major lessons that have been very helpful.
I'm sure there's a vulnerability to that silence too, because when you invite the divine into that silence, you have to be ready for what comes with it.
There's a vulnerability to all of this.
Yes, absolutely.
When we're in the belly of the whale, and we're in that liminal space, and it is a time that we are extremely vulnerable, and we have to kind of chuck the ego aside and just literally lay down the ground and say, God, I can't do this. We surrender.
From doing the group, have there been any other folks who have shared a part of their story and how they've had insight as a result of having this ability to sort of reflect and learn?
Absolutely. And
I don't know who's you're allowed to share, but if they were on Facebook, they're probably public.
They're pretty public, although people can post anonymously, and some people will to shield their stories. A lot of people have talked a lot about caregiving and the difficulties that are involved in caregiving. And how do we give to others and yet maintain a part of ourselves? And so that's been a huge lesson that there's been a lot of discussion about. And of course, you know the whole adage, they say that when you're on a flight and it's going down, the first thing you do is take the oxygen mask and put it on yourself as opposed to someone else. That's a lesson that's much easier said than done. And so that's something that I hear and see a lot, is the importance of really taking time to nurture oneself.
And do you find that there are a key number of things that people bring to this, or the experiences they've had? Is it a lot of caregivers? Is it a lot of personal things that's happened to an individual, where it's their health or their whatever? But do you see some themes to what seems to be affecting people, or is it just all over the place?
It's all over the place, but what's interesting, Tom, is I would say the vast majority of the members or readers that are on the Facebook page are people that may not be in the midst of a life right now. But they're there because they're curious, and it spurs and reminds them about something that they've learned in the past that they grow on, that they grow up. As you know, and I've learned that, most often we can read about something and we really don't grasp the wisdom that's in it. We really have to experience it. So I think in a lot of cases, people come to the page for a little bit of inspiration during the day. As you know, Facebook's filled with a lot of, this is what I had to eat today, and you can see how pretty my table is, and this, that, and the other. So this is an opportunity for those that may want to go a little bit more inspiration and go a little bit more deeper than your typical Facebook post.
Yeah. Well, it's clear from just what goes on in the world that there's a pretty good chance there's some folks here that are dealing with life quakes right now in the midst of one thing or another. What wisdom do you have for those of us who may be in a life quake right now or starting to come to the realization, the acceptance that we're experiencing one?
I'm going to look at my notes because I wrote this down. There were 4 things that I found really helped me keep my sanity. And I think it's important. Number 1 is we have to remember that this too will pass. That everything in life is a cycle. And when we think about it, life is in constant motion. We'd like to freeze it because we feel safe and we can keep things right where they are. But things are always changing. And given time, although the average life quake is going to take us about 5 years to work through, but given time, there is always light at the end of the tunnel. It's just being in that tunnel that's there. Number 2, the importance, as we talked about, of nurturing yourself during that time. To really remember that you can only be as good for other people as you're good for yourself. So to really take the time to be gentle with ourselves. And that's been another lesson I've learned, is how to be more compassionate with us. Number 3, always plan something that you look forward to. Have something on the calendar that you know is something that you look forward to. So whatever you're in, know that there's something brighter there. And then 4, I think it's super important to find support. Having a close circle of friends who you can really rely on and talk to and be honest with is hugely important. Or a lot of times, this is a great time to find a therapist or a coach or a spiritual guide, or all 3 of them. But whatever it is, make sure that you've got a strong support system. And then as a bonus, as I keep coming back to the most important thing, is just to pay attention. Pay attention to what's going on.
And I would think spiritual life in there, which ties into doing something for yourself, is essential.
Absolutely.
In all its forms.
Absolutely.
As you shared earlier.
And to know, and this goes back to finding support, to know that you're never alone. That you're never alone. I can remember when I was going through this awful divorce, and I can remember at night going to bed and visualizing God holding my ex-wife, my wife at the time, and being in the palm of his hand. And that brought comfort of knowing that as awful as this experience was, this was something that we didn't have to go alone, and that we were being supported.
Yeah, and I've tried to help people in the past to realize that we don't promise that everything's going to be okay. We promise that we'll be okay.
Absolutely.
I mean, when you have the end of a marriage, it's not going to be okay in the sense that it is going to come to an end, and it's going to die, that relationship, and take on a new life, a cordial one, in some cases. But that not being okay does not mean we're going to disappear or we're going to turn into an explosion of dust. We will be okay because God journeys with us.
Absolutely.
It just takes time to get to that place where we realize it again. So.
You look at the life of Christ, and he had the ministry, but then there was death. But after that death, there was resurrection. And there is always something new that will emerge from the death. I mean, we have to let nature's taught us that things have to be, there has to be a forest fire in order for new growth to come in the forest grow. So as nature is taught us, so our lives are.
Yeah. And you haven't put a cause and effect into this, but one of the things I always think of is sometimes we blame God for the things that happen because we meet God in the things that happen. And it's not cause and effect, right? But it is looking around in the midst of these and saying, okay, God, where are you? Because I'm going to need your help to get through and get out. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And not taking, the other part is being compassionate with ourselves. A lot of times we get an illness and we think, oh, if only I had done this, or I'm being punished for this, or what have you. A lot of times life just happens, but I do believe that there's a divine purpose to all of this, and that there's always, even in the most devastating things that happen, I believe there are always gifts to be found. It may take a long time to find those gifts, but I do believe they will show up.
So before we end, we have a few minutes to see if anybody has a question they want to ask. Does anybody have a question for Randy? Some of you just been introduced to Belly of the Whale. How many of you knew about Belly of the Whale before today? Okay, so you've got some group members here.
Maybe one comment?
Sure, please.
All of us right now are going through the belly of the whale, whether we know it or not. All of us are experiencing this low-level anxiety, and the reason why is we're in the midst of a huge societal change. We're right in the middle of what has been called the great unraveling. Everything that we know, look at which everybody's nodding their heads, everything that we know from government to religion to name it is unraveling. Business is unraveling before our eyes, right? And at the same time, there's something happening with the great turning. And I believe we are shifting into a world that's going to be more self-sustaining and realizing that we really are all one, and what I do affects you, and we are all interconnected. Might not happen in my lifetime, but I do believe we're shifting there. But we're in that liminal space between the unraveling and between the great turning. And that's uncomfortable. That's anxiety-producing. It's hard stuff. And so I believe that all of us, whether we're aware of it or not, are in the belly of the whale as we start to go through the shift. The question is where do we focus our attention? Do we focus our attention on the unraveling, or do we focus our attention on what will be the great turning? And so I believe that when we focus our attention here, that's when magic will start to happen.
Yeah. So we have time for a question. Al?
I just want to support what he just said. I'm not here to promote it, but I'm reading a book called The Fourth Turning. Its basic thesis is every 80 years, each generation, each individual, and society collectively goes through massive changes. And it's a very challenging book to read, but it is so far spot on.
What's the name of it again?
It's called The Fourth Turning by Neil Howe, Howe. And it's part psychology, part sociology, but it espouses, you're saying, thinking.
I believe that we as spiritual people, as this group is we have a role and a responsibility right now to help people focus on what can be.
Well, Randy, thank you.
Thank you.
It takes a lot to sit in front of a room of people and share things that are so personal and deep, but we thank you for doing that. And I hope that you'll come back next Sunday. Next Sunday, we're going to talk to Susan Shipman. I know many of you know Susan, and you know that Susan works with bees, and we're going to talk more about her purpose and passion as well. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to talk to Christina. Or did we move them?
I think we moved them.
So you next week?
Yeah, you're next
You're
week.
next week now.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're next week, and then Susan. But I hope you all will come back, and then we'll get to know Christina next Sunday. So, thank you, Randy.
Thank you
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.